Hello, I'm Dale Matchek, Chairman of the Econ program at Northwood University. Welcome to our Freedom Seminar, where we discuss ways in which the Northwood idea applies to current issues of the day, political, economic, ethical, and the issue of today is COVID-19. And we're here today to talk about putting this in historical perspective. We've heard from a number of speakers already this weekend that the word unprecedented has been overused here. There certainly are crises that we faced in the past, and we can learn from those. And to help us do that, today we've invited Professor Christopher Douglas. He's the chair of the Econ department at the University of Michigan at their Flint campus. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Christopher Douglas before we begin. He is kind of a man of many talents. He first earned his undergraduate degree in electrical engineering before he earned his bachelor's in economics. He's got his Ph.D. in economics from Michigan State University, and his research interests include applied macroeconomics, energy economics, public finance, and sports economics. He's published his research in many journals, including the Journal of Applied Econometrics, Journal of International Financial Markets, Institutions and Money, Energy Economics, and the Oxford Review of Economic Policy and Economic Letters. And he currently serves as co-editor of the Journal of Economic Insight. So I'm happy to introduce Professor Christopher Douglas. Thank you, Dr. Douglas.
Hey, thank you, Dale. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me here today. I think I've been at the Northwood University Freedom Seminar for the 5th time now. It's a really great event, and I enjoy putting these talks together, although I wish it could be in person, of course. We do live, I was going to say in unprecedented times, but Dale just said that that word is overused. So I'll say unique. You know, we're living in a unique time with COVID-19, and we haven't seen a recession like the one we're currently seeing. But I think there are lessons to be learned from previous recessions and how they apply to COVID-19 to see what we might expect as we move forward, and hopefully once we recover after the pandemic is brought under control, which is what my talk is going to be about today. So when you think about recessions, recessions, at least since the end of World War II, are either caused by a demand shock or a supply shock. So if we think about demand shocks, a demand shock means that the demand for goods and services collapses throughout the economy. Classic cause is a stock market crash, results in consumers being less wealthy, and as a result, they spend less money. Or maybe interest rates increase, which reduces the demand for so-called big-ticket consumer goods, things like automobiles, houses, and investment goods such as machines and equipment. Just things that people need to borrow money in order to buy. The Great Depression between 1929 and 1945 is an example of a demand shock. Consumers lost their jobs, lost their income, they often lost their homes, which reduced the demand for goods and services. The stock market famously crashed at the onset of the Great Depression, which reduced consumer wealth. Banks failed, which I'll talk about later on, which collapsed the loanable funds market, which reduced the demand for these big ticket items that I mentioned earlier. So big demand shock with the Great Depression. If we fast forward to 2007 to 2009, we have the Great Recession, which is a mini Great Depression, in that there's a stock market decline, massive job losses, massive loss of income, and also a financial crisis that reduced the demand for goods and services. Sandwiched in between these two demand shocks is we have a recession between 1981 and 1982. That's a Federal Reserve-induced recession, Federal Reserve-induced demand shock, where Paul Volcker, who was the chair of the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve at the time, and the rest of the Board of Governors dramatically increased interest rates in order to, in his words, break the back of inflation. Due to loose monetary fiscal policy in the 1960s and 1970s, inflation became a real problem by the mid-1970s, as price indices like the Consumer Price Index increased by double-digit percentages year to year. People saw goods and services get progressively more expensive, while they saw the purchasing power of their life savings in the bank get whittled down by inflation. President Nixon tried to fight inflation with wage and price controls, which failed because wage and price controls don't tackle the root cause of inflation, namely excessive growth of the money supply. President Ford fought inflation by having people wear buttons that said "win," which stood for "whip inflation now." And in fact, I have one of those buttons. This is what it looked like if you could see it. Little red button that says "win" stood for "whip inflation now." You can also get a little sticker, which I also have. I just like to collect these things, so I bought this on eBay a while back. Obviously, that doesn't solve inflation. Wearing a button and putting a sticker on your TV doesn't reduce the growth rate of prices in the economy. The way to solve inflation is, of course, to slam on the brakes on the growth rate of the money supply. Interest rates skyrocket, demand collapses in the short run, but inflation is reduced in the long run. People alive back then might remember mortgage interest rates being as high as 25%, and the recession being really severe. In Michigan, the unemployment rate in the early 1980s hit 17%. So those are examples of demand shocks. Supply-driven recessions are called supply shocks. Post-World War II, supply shocks have been caused by a sudden increase in the price of crude oil. I'll talk about these recessions in more detail later on in this talk, but just real quickly, the way to think about this is that crude oil is an input to almost everything produced in the economy. Gasoline, of course, other forms of energy such as jet fuel and heating oil, asphalt is made out of crude oil, synthetic materials such as plastic are made out of crude oil, and so forth. So when the price of crude oil spikes, it becomes difficult to produce all these things. So supply decreases throughout the economy, and there's a recession. And there's been 3 supply shocks since the end of World War II. Well, why is COVID-19 unique? Again, I'm not going to say unprecedented, I'll say unique. Well, it's unique because we have a supply and a demand shock occurring simultaneously. Demand in the economy has collapsed due to the pandemic as consumers are confined to their homes. It's hard to go shopping when you're illegally prevented from going to most stores. People are also suffering a loss of income, loss of job security, seeing the value of their 401k decline as the stock market declines, which further reduces the demand for goods and services. People are also buckling down, reducing spending to try to get through these hard times, which further reduces demand. Supply throughout the economy has collapsed due to the government forcing businesses to close, workers being furloughed, factories being shut down, and the pandemic disrupting things like international travel, trade, and global supply chains. And as far as I can tell, we've never had a recession where both supply and demand have simultaneously decreased like that. Recessions, at least in recent history, are caused by either one or the other. So what I want to do is use the Great Depression to examine the demand shock going on right now, use the oil shocks to examine the supply shock going on right now, and try to think about what lessons we can learn for these business cycles to apply to our current unique situation. So just how unique is our situation? Well, if you compare the current situation to the Great Depression, things look pretty bleak. During Black Monday and Black Tuesday on the onset of the Great Depression, which are October 28 and October 29, 1929, the stock market loses 23% of its value. Between February 18th and March 18th, 2020, the stock market loses 32% of its value. Although it's regained maybe about half of its losses, I think the stock market's in the 23,000 range at this point. It was 29,000 back in February. It hits a low of like 18,500. It's bounced back up to about 23,000 or so. Comparing the stock market decline now to back then is a little bit apples and oranges because I'm comparing 2 days in 1929 to a month in 2020. And the stock market does fall by more than 23% as the Great Depression drags on. It's just that the current stock market decline was very volatile, where you have days where the stock market declines by 2,000 plus points, followed by rallies of 1,500 points or so. So it's not clear what 2-day period I should use as a comparison to Black Monday and Black Tuesday. Just the point I want to make is that the February-March stock market crash is on par with what we saw during the onset of the Great Depression. If you think about GDP, which is gross domestic product, or the total value of all vital goods and services produced in the economy, that contracts by 26.3% between 1929 and 1933 during the Great Depression, with the unemployment rate peaking at 25.6% in May 1933. We don't have data on things like gross domestic product yet for COVID-19. The unemployment rate's over 14% right now. Firms such as J.P. Morgan project that the unemployment rate will hit 20% by the summer, which, given that unemployment's 14% now, that seems like a pretty reasonable projection, which means that in the second quarter 2020, the economy will contract by about 40% or so. The Wall Street Journal, for instance, found that 24% of the economy was idled even before Easter. That was like 6 weeks ago or so. It's striking that it took the Great Depression 4 years, 1929 to 1933, to see GDP contract and unemployment hit rates that we're seeing in just a couple months for COVID-19, which just illustrates the severity and the suddenness of the deterioration we're experiencing because of the lockdown. So really, the multi-trillion-dollar question is the U.S. entering into another Great Depression? Economic indicators like the stock market, GDP contraction, and the unemployment rate are Great Depression level bad. So does this mean that we're getting ready to settle into a 16-year slog with mass unemployment, foreclosures, things like bread lines? The Great Depression lasted 16 years and experienced all those things. I think the optimistic answer, which I'm sticking to at least so far, is not yet. I think the reason why we're not yet getting ready to enter into a Great Depression, despite the economic indicators being bad, is because so far we're avoiding the mistakes, the completely preventable mistakes that led to the Great Depression in the first place, although there's certainly plenty of time to still make them. So some policy mistakes that led to the Great Depression, just to kind of run through what caused the Great Depression to be so great. And I'll talk about the background of my slide in a second here. The first policy mistake is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is a massive tariff on a broad array of goods. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was originally intended to protect agricultural products. That was a promise by President Hoover when he was elected president in 1928. But tariffs back then had to get through Congress. And the whole, you scratch your back, or I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, part of the legislative process took hold during this process. The congressman said, well, I'll support agricultural tariffs, if tariffs in my district get protected too. And as a result, we ended up with a huge tariff bill that protected almost everything in the U.S. economy. This led to a trade war as other countries retaliated with tariffs against American exports, and international trade grinds to a halt. In 1933, after Smoot-Hawley is passed and enacted, international trade is something like 1/3 as large as what it was before the tariff took place. When people talk about the stock market crash in October 1929, they never really talk about why the stock market crashed. They just take it as given that there had to be a stock market crash because the roaring 20s was a strong economy. And I just don't agree with that. There's nothing inevitable about the stock market crash, and there's nothing inevitable about the Great Depression. To preview what my conclusion really is that the Great Depression was so severe because of all of these numerous fiscal and monetary policy mistakes. They turned what should have been a minor recession into a 16-year depression. But anyway, the stock market begins declining on October 21st, 1929, because that's the day the U.S. Senate unexpectedly passes the Smoot-Hawley tariff. The tariff had passed the House of Representatives, but it was widely expected to die in the Senate. But on October 21st, for some reason, 16 senators switched their vote from no to yes. On the front page of the New York Times back then, there's a story about Smoot-Hawley passing the Senate, right next to a story about the stock market declining. It's interesting that you have the famous stock market crash in 1929, but what people don't realize is that by April 1930, the stock market had recovered almost all of its losses. The reason for that is because it was widely expected that the Smoot-Hawley tariff would die in the House-Senate Conference Committee, as the House and the Senate couldn't reconcile their differences into a final tariff bill. But for some reason, they unexpectedly did in June. The final bill passed the House and the Senate, and it was signed into law by President Hoover. And the stock market begins crashing again. So I think there's a convincing case to be made that absent the Smoot-Hawley tariff, there wouldn't have been a stock market crash in the first place. The second policy mistake that leads to the Great Depression is the Federal Reserve fails to act as a lender of last resort. I'm going to skip that to the next slide because this is such a colossal blunder that it deserves its own separate slide. Unit banking laws, another big mistake that leads to the Great Depression. We take branch banking for granted now, and we just assume that every major city is going to have a branch of, say, Chase Bank in it. But branch banking is a fairly recent phenomenon because the U.S. used to have what are called unit banking laws, which outlawed branch banking. As the name implies, a bank was only allowed to have one branch. The reason for these laws appears to be to protect the local community bank who couldn't compete with the economies of scale that were offered by large national New York City banks. Well, okay, that sounds great to protect the local community bank, but what's the problem? Well, the problem is that unit banking laws meant the local community bank didn't have a diverse loan portfolio. One of the first laws of investing is to diversify your portfolio, but unit banking laws prevented banks from issuing loans outside of the geographical area they were located in, since banks couldn't have branches in other areas. So a bank in Iowa would make loans primarily to farmers. A bank in Detroit would make loans primarily to the auto industry. A bank in Pittsburgh would make loans primarily to the steel industry and so forth. Thomas Rustisi, I think I'm pronouncing that right, I might not be, of George Mason University argues that these unit banking laws and the Smoot-Hawley tariff play a key role in the bank failures at the onset of the Great Depression, which caused the Great Depression to be so great. Because the Smoot-Hawley trade war drives up demand for American exports of things like agricultural products, automobiles, steel, and so forth. So farmers, auto companies, steel producers, and other businesses that really are export dependent couldn't pay their loans back and defaulted. Meaning banks at places like Iowa, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, the loans on their books go bad. And since unit banking laws meant that these banks didn't have a diverse loan portfolio, these banks couldn't absorb these losses by having good loans on their books from different industries in different parts of the country. And as a result, these banks failed. Support for the idea that unit banking laws lead to bank failures comes from Canada. Canada had branch banking during the 1930s, and Canada saw no bank failures during the Great Depression, even though the Great Depression hits Canada just as hard as the U.S. In contrast, about 10,000 banks fail in the U.S. During the 1930s, which is about 1/3 of all banks in the country. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or I call it the NRA for short, another big policy mistake during the Great Depression. What this act does is it organizes industries into cartels with prices fixed by the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA for short. If a business set a price below the NRA allowed price, the business owner could find himself facing fines or jail time. What a business owner would do is he would hang a sign at his window with the NRA Blue Eagle on it to tell everyone that the business owner was abiding by the NRA cartel. And that's what my background is. This is what the sign looked like. If you owned like a bakery, you're part of the baker's cartel, and you put the sign in the window to tell everyone that you're part of the cartel. Incidentally, just as some trivia, the Philadelphia Eagles of the NFL have the Eagle mascot because the founder of the team, a guy named Bert Bell, was a huge FDR supporter and thus named the team after the NRA Blue Eagle, so hence the Philadelphia Eagles. Anyway, the Roosevelt administration does this because they mistake falling prices during the onset of the Great Depression as being from, quote, excessive competition instead of being from deflation caused by a collapse in the money supply, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So we know why prices could fall in the economy. They could fall because there's widespread deflation, or prices could fall because businesses are competitive and charging low prices. And the Roosevelt administration mistakes deflation for competitive practices on the part of business, and decides that, well, we'll stop this destructive price cutting by just forcing everyone to charge the NRA-approved price. Well, the problem is that organizing the economy into cartels and fixing prices centrally obviously worsens economic efficiency. It obviously worsens the efficiency of the price system. The act was declared unconstitutional in 1935 in the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States Supreme Court case. The Schechter brothers were two chicken butchers in New York City who faced 60 counts of violating the U.S. Poultry Code by charging a price lower than the NRA-approved price. It's just amazing to think about that. There were people who went to prison for charging a price that was too low back then. It reminds me of a Chris Rock skit in a comedy album in the 1990s where he has this bit about going to jail because he was driving too slow. Well, going to jail because you're charging a price that's too low seems about that same speed. But anyway, the Schechter brothers were convicted on 19 of these 60 counts, but their conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court. Their case is detailed in Amelie Schle's wonderful book called The Forgotten Man. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA for short, another example of misguided legislation that prolonged the Depression. The AAA did things like paying farmers to not grow crops and paid farmers to destroy livestock in order to prop up agricultural prices. Because again, the Roosevelt administration mistakes falling prices as being from excessive competition rather than being from a collapse in the money supply. The AAA also paid cotton farmers $100 million to plow under 10 million acres of farmland, paid farmers to slaughter 6 million pigs, 12,000 acres of tobacco were burned, oat harvests were burned, California peaches were left to rot on the trees, amongst other things. All this is detailed in Jim Powell's book entitled FDR's Folly, How Roosevelt and His New Deal Prolonged the Great Depression. There were also massive tax increases during the Great Depression. 1932 sees the largest tax increase in American history, where the bottom tax rate goes from 1.5% to 4%, which is a 167% increase. The top rate goes from 25% to 63%, which is a 152% increase. There's another big tax increase in 1936, where the top rate goes from 63% to 79%. This is just massive restrictive fiscal policy, which is exactly the opposite of what should have been done during this time. Also in 1936, there's a corporate profits tax with a 74% rate that's implemented. Taxes during this time should have been cut, not increased, let alone having the biggest tax increase in American history. Just as a quick aside, the income tax is a good reason why people don't trust the federal government. The income tax is enacted after the 16th Amendment, which is ratified in 1913. At the time, the bottom rate's 1%, the top rate's 7%, and the federal government is like, well, hey, don't worry about it. The income tax is always going to be low, right? Well, just 5 years later, in 1918, the bottom rate goes from 1% to 6%, and the top rate goes from 7% to 77%. Harding and Coolidge managed to cut the bottom rate back down to 1.5% and the top rate back down to 25% in the mid-1920s. So, of course, right, historians judge them as some of our worst presidents. And income tax rates stay low like that until they're hiked again in the 1930s. Those tax hikes in the 1930s, raised the income tax rate to very high levels. And they stay at high levels until Ronald Reagan cuts them in the 1980s. Economic historian Robert Higgs calls this a time period of regime uncertainty, where in the 1930s, property rights were insecure, businesses were unsure about what the so-called rules of the game would be for the economy. And FDR spoke just a lot of anti-business rhetoric. Example Higgs cites includes the fact that just 3 years after the National Industrial Recovery Act is declared unconstitutional, FDR implements what's called the Temporary National Economic Council to vigorously enforce antitrust laws. So if you're a business owner during this time period, what are you supposed to believe? Are cartels good or bad? In the early 1930s, the NIRA says, well, if you charge a price that's too low, you go to prison. Now the Temporary National Economic Council says, if you try to fix prices at a high level, you go to prison. So as a business owner, you just kind of throw up your hands and say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Higgs also cites 38 acts of Congress that substantially weakened private property rights during this time. In polls, business owners viewed the government as detrimental to the economic recovery and believed that the economy that emerged after the Depression would have just a lot more government involvement. 40% of business owners thought the government would have complete control over the economy after the Great Depression was over. If you read FDR's acceptance speech at the 1936 Democratic Convention, you can see examples of his anti-business rhetoric. He calls businessmen, quote, dictators, amongst other things, and declares war on them, saying, quote, I am enlisted for the duration of this war. So with all this going on, this is obviously not an environment that's conducive to businesses investing in capital and expanding their operations. If you're a business owner, why would you? If you didn't think your property rights were secure. Robert Higgs argues that this is why private investment collapses in the 1930s, where the nation's capital stock in 1940 is lower than what it was in 1930. Investment in capital doesn't begin to increase again until World War II, where the government needs businesses to ramp up production in order to meet war demand. And the Dow Jones doesn't return to its pre-1929 level until the mid-1950s. And that's something people don't really realize, that after Smoot-Hawley passes and the stock market begins crashing again, the stock market doesn't regain all of its losses until sometime around 1954, 1955. Just to wrap this up, the one good thing, I will say that FDR did one good thing, is that he revalued the dollar against the gold standard in 1933, where he increased the price of gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. By making the dollar more expensive against the gold standard, the money supply is increased to drive up the price of gold. And this was really needed at the time to offset the money supply collapse that occurred, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. However, in 1937, the Federal Reserve bungles again. It increases interest rates and reduces the money supply, which unleashes a secondary depression. Unemployment, which had fallen from 25% down to 14%, increases back up to 19%. Gross domestic product declines by 3.3% after 4 straight years of slow but steady expansion. A 3.3% decrease in gross domestic product, that's larger than the decrease that we saw during the Great Recession 10 years ago. The Great Depression isn't technically one long depression. It's technically 3 separately dated recessions according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which dates the business cycle, which suggests that it's really these policy mistakes that caused the Great Depression, because they cut off the recovery at its knees once it gets going. So let me go and talk about the Federal Reserve causing the Great Depression. The main cause of the Great Depression is the Federal Reserve allows one-third of the banks in the U.S. to fail between 1929 and 1933. This is a picture in my background of a famous bank failure in history. It's the failure of the Fidelity Fiduciary Bank and Mary Poppins. It's a great example of the potential instability of the fractional reserve banking system. The clip is on YouTube. I show it to my students when I teach principles of macroeconomics. But at any rate, why are bank failures such a problem, and why is avoiding them so key to get through this COVID situation unscathed? Well, the fractional reserve banking system means that when a bank takes a deposit, the bank only keeps a fraction of that deposit on hand in the form of cash in the vault, and then uses the rest of the deposit to issue a loan. So if someone makes like a $1,000 deposit in the bank might keep $100 of that deposit as cash in the vault, and the bank then loans the other $900 out, perhaps for a car loan. And then that loan gets paid back slowly over time. When the car is purchased with that loan, the car seller receives the $900, deposits it into the bank. The bank might keep $90 and then loan the other $810 out. So that $1,000 deposit causes the money supply to go up to $1,900. The original depositor has his $1,000 and the car seller has his $900. And we could keep going with this example. That third $810 loan gets loaned out, it gets spent, redeposited, lather, rinse, repeat. In practice, what happens is a $1 deposit causes another $1 increase in the money supply through this lending channel, which means that a $1 deposit increases the money supply to $2. So, okay, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is when this works in reverse, we get a big mess on our hands. Because when a bank fails, the money supply just completely collapses. So if the two banks of the example I've been talking about fail, the money supply would collapse by $1,900. The original depositor wouldn't get his $1,000 back, and the car seller wouldn't get his $900 back, both of which were in their checking accounts. Because the bank doesn't have these deposits on hand as cash, they're gone, having been loaned out. So when 1/3 of the banks fail during the Great Depression, the money supply falls by about 1/3. As Milton Friedman would point out, the price level is proportional to the money supply. So when 1/3 of the banks fail, which causes the money supply to fall by 1/3, we get 30% deflation across the economy, which means prices across the board fall by 30%. And you might say, what's the problem with deflation? Is it deflation good? Falling prices is good. And yeah, it's good, all else equal, but all else isn't equal. Because if you're a worker, you saw your wages fall by 30%, and all of a sudden you can't make your mortgage payment. If you're a farmer, you see crop prices fall by 30%, and all of a sudden you can't make the mortgage payment on your farm. Because loans are fixed in nominal terms, meaning loans don't get adjusted for inflation or deflation. When there's no deflation or inflation, that's not a problem. But when there's inflation or deflation, all of a sudden you've got a big mess on your hands. So what happens is that this deflation leads to a wave of defaults, meaning banks don't get repaid for the loans they issued, meaning they can no longer repay depositors, and thus the banks failed. Bank failures can lead to more bank failures as people run on banks in order to get their money out before their bank fails. So for instance, suppose my bank is healthy, but I see banks starting to fail a couple towns over. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to race down to my bank, get my money out, just to be on the safe side. And if everyone does that, well, all of a sudden, my bank runs out of cash, can't repay depositors, and fails. So once bank failures get going, they can just kind of really rip through the economy, as the expectation of a bank failure can cause a bank failure. It's a self-fulfilling expectation. The Federal Reserve is supposed to put a stop to all this and be a lender of last resort to banks facing these problems. The Federal Reserve is supposed to loan cash to banks so banks could repay depositors, and the banks could repay these loans once things settle down. For reasons that are still not clear, the Federal Reserve during the Great Depression just completely refuses to do this. Milton Friedman blames the Federal Reserve in his book, A Monetary History of the United States, for why the Great Depression was so great. Being the lender of last resort is basically the single reason why the Federal Reserve was created in the first place with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. 26 years later, they completely blow it. It's the literal definition of you had one job. And people will be saying the same thing about the CDC's failure at the onset of COVID-19. The CDC is a government agency that literally has one job, preventing the spread of disease. That's what the D is in CDC. And they completely blow it too. And people wonder why there's not a lot of confidence in government, right? But at any rate, to bring this back to COVID-19, the Great Depression was caused by these numerous monetary and fiscal policy mistakes, turning what should have been a minor economic downturn caused by a negative economic shock, namely the Smoot-Hawley tariff, into a massive, prolonged depression. Federal Reserve inaction allows the money supply and the banking system to collapse, which causes a massive financial crisis. And financial crises are the most severe recessions with the slowest recoveries. That's why the recovery for the 08-09 recession was so slow. Fiscal policy mistakes resulted in massive tax increases and a weakening of the overall efficiency of the price system. So far, we seem to be avoiding these mistakes so far. The Federal Reserve is acting as a lender of last resort right now by injecting liquidity into financial markets, which for the time being is avoiding a financial crisis. So the Federal Reserve is not repeating the mistake it made in the early 1930s. There's a time limit for how long the Federal Reserve can do that, but so far it's holding off a financial crisis. The $2 trillion stimulus, the CARES Act, stands for Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, because every piece of legislation needs a catchy acronym, provides expanded unemployment insurance, loans and grants to small businesses. Lots of Americans got a $1,200 check. This allows people to continue paying their bills during the shutdown, which for the time being allows people to avoid bread lines and it avoids having a repeat of the so-called Hoovervilles, which were cardboard shacks people lived in during the Great Depression after they lost their homes because of mortgage defaults. Hoovervilles were named after President Hoover, who people blamed for the Great Depression. Completely unfairly, by the way, but life's unfair, so the name stuck. So the stimulus is flawed. If I was in Congress, I think I would have held my nose and voted for it anyway, because what piece of legislation is perfect? But it does allow people to continue making mortgage payments, continue buying groceries, and it also allows lenders who made those mortgages to get repaid for the time being, which means that they can repay people who supplied funds for these loans, which for the time being is avoiding a financial crisis. So even though economic indicators are Great Depression level bad, we're avoiding for the time being another Great Depression because we're avoiding those completely preventable mistakes that led to the first one. That's a real tough pill to swallow, especially if you lived through the Great Depression, to say all that suffering could have easily been prevented by really anyone who read a Principles of Macroeconomics textbook and understood it. These are some pretty elementary policy mistakes. So if we fast forward 90 years into the future, the policy mistake I'm afraid people will look back on us as making is that we're just keeping the lockdown lasting way too long. Because from my perspective, what's happening is the goalposts to reopen the economy keep getting moved. Back in mid-March, the economy was shut down in order to flatten the curve, which never meant reduce the number of infections. What it meant was spread out the infections over time, so at any one point in time, the hospitals don't get overwhelmed. Well, that's been done. And in fact, it's been more than done. Where if you go to websites like the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation out of the University of Washington, you can see what they predicted versus what actually happened. And the wave of hospitalizations, they just never materialized. So rather than declaring victory and reopening the economy, well, now it seems to be some sort of combination of, well, we need to either completely eliminate the virus or drive new infections down to zero or develop a vaccine. And keeping the economy shut down that long, that's just not feasible. A vaccine's a year and a half away under the best of circumstances and impossible to get under the worst of circumstances. Like, for instance, there's still not a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. You could go back to the early 1980s when the HIV/AIDS crisis was getting going and people were saying, well, vaccine's a couple years out. Well, 40 years later, it's still not here. Well, the reason why we can't keep the economy shut down for much longer is because, well, eventually what the Federal Reserve is doing is going to cause inflation. Eventually, printing $2 trillion for more stimulus spending will cause inflation. If 40% of the economy is idled right now, this is just a recipe for the so-called too much money chasing too few goods and services, which is inflation. Or if there's no more stimulus packages and the Federal Reserve stops acting as a lender of last resort and the lockdown continues, well, then you get a financial crisis. People will stop paying their mortgages, loans, corporate debt will get repaid, and then we'll have a real mess on our hands. Because if 40% of the economy is idled right now, output is 40% lower, at some point, people's income has to drop to the reduced level of output. Right now, it's kind of being papered over in the short run, which I think is, I hate to say it, but probably the right thing to do. You just can't do it for too much longer. So let me move on to talk about supply shocks, about what we could learn from them for COVID-19. So the first oil price shock occurs in 1973, following an OPEC oil embargo against the U.S. in protest of the U.S.'s support of the State of Israel. Oil triples in price between July 1973 and January 1974. It goes from $3.56 a barrel to $10.11 a barrel. Basically, that's overnight, 6 months. In economic terms, that's overnight. And I should note that this $3.56 per barrel price in July 1973, this is basically unchanged since the end of World War II. The U.S. economy had really gotten used to steady, cheap, abundant crude oil. So when that stops being the case, you get a really bad recession as it becomes difficult to produce or supply all the products that use crude oil as an input, which is why this is called a supply shock. Gross domestic product contracts by 2.4%, and the unemployment rate peaks at 9% in May 1973. More importantly, oil never falls back down in price to over a decade later. The price of oil stays high for the next 13 years. It's not until March 1986 where, adjusted for inflation, the price of oil gets close to what it was before the first oil shock. What that means is that there's a long, slow, painful transition in the economy away from energy-intensive industries that depend on cheap oil to more energy-efficient industries. And I'll talk about that after I talk about the second oil shock. But before moving on to that, during the first oil shock, there's also a price ceiling on gasoline, which prevents the price of gasoline from rising in response to the increase of the price of crude oil. As a result, there's rampant shortages of gasoline that persist in the economy, which is the so-called gas crisis. This leads to massive lines at gas stations, like the one in the picture of my slide, as well as black markets and hoarding. Like I told my principles of microeconomics students, it's striking how the gas lines in response to the shortages caused by the price ceiling back then look so similar to lines outside of grocery stores today in response to price ceilings called anti-price gouging laws, which also lead to black markets and hoarding. So there's a second oil shock in 1979, which is arguably more devastating to the economy than the first, because it occurs when oil is already expensive. So the background for this is that there's protests against the pro-Western leader of Iran, the Shah of Iran. Shah means king, so Iran is run by a king at this time. He's a pro-American king, which is slightly ironic given how this country was founded, but since he wasn't our king, I guess he was cool. He's kind of an interesting guy. He threw a pretty wicked party for, I think, either the 500th or the 2000th anniversary of the Persian Empire. I can't remember. It's some big number like that. Nixon was there, for instance. But anyway, blowing a bunch of money at a party like that, amongst other things, doesn't sit super well with the population, and protests start to begin. Well, those protests don't die out, and eventually the Shah flees on January 16, 1979, for the U.S. The regime collapses about a month later. And then on April 1st, 1979, Iran becomes an anti-Western Islamic theocracy. The Iran we all know and love today. So, happy April Fool's Day, 1979. Well, the revolution takes the entire world by surprise, including the CIA. The CIA missed one. That's never happened before. That's never happened after. And the reason why the revolution takes the world by surprise is because it's not preceded by a military defeat or an economic collapse like many revolutions are. The Russian Revolution happens after World War I. The French Revolution happens after the French crown just announces to the public that they're out of money. That leads to instability in France. It did turn out at the time that the Shah had terminal cancer that people didn't know about, and a terminally ill leader turns out to be often overthrown. But anyway, what happens with the Iranian Revolution is that it significantly disrupts Iranian oil production. And at the time, Iran is a huge source of the world's crude oil production. For instance, in 1978, the year before the Iranian Revolution, Iran supplies 9% of the total world supply of crude oil. In 1979, during the revolution, Iranian oil production falls by 40%. From 5.2 million barrels per day to 3.2 million barrels per day. Then Iranian oil production falls by another 50% in 1980, from 3.2 million barrels per day to 1.7 million barrels per day. In 1981, Iranian oil production falls by another 25%, from 1.7 million barrels per day to 1.3 million barrels per day. Due to the Iranian Revolution, Iranian oil production falls by 75% in total. The effect of this is that world oil production falls by 15% during this time because, again, Iran is such a huge source of the world's crude oil supply. Total world oil production goes from something like 62 million barrels a day to 53 million barrels per day. The result of this massive decrease in supply of just basic supply and demand analysis is that you get a big increase in price. Oil goes from about $15 a barrel before the revolution to about $40 a barrel in April 1980. So what that means is the cumulative effect of these two oil shocks is that between 1973 and 1980, the price of oil increases by a factor of 10. which means that energy-intensive industries, things like steel production, auto manufacturing, really get hammered. And then right after the second oil shock, you get the demand shock that I mentioned earlier in this talk, where the Federal Reserve increases interest rates to break the back of inflation. So if you think about 1973 to 1982, it's a bit like COVID-19 in the sense that you have two supply shocks followed by a big demand shock. It's just that the supply and demand shocks happened simultaneously with COVID-19 rather than happening a few years apart from each other back then. But probably that 1973 to 1982 time period is the best analogy we have to what's going on right now. So to put the oil shocks in perspective, this is the graph of the price of crude oil, price of a barrel of crude oil over time. So you can see how crude oil was cheap and the price was steady and cheap until the first oil shock, where the price of oil goes shooting up, which coincides to a recession, which is the gray bar. And then the Middle East oil embargo, the first oil shock technically is over by March 1974, but the price of oil stays high because OPEC colludes to keep the price high. They're like, well, hey, this increase of the price of oil causes our profits to go way up. Let's collude to keep profits high. So that's what's happening. Second oil shock hits due to the Iranian Revolution. Price of oil goes shooting all the way up to nearly $40 a barrel. Another recession. The price of oil stays high, starts to trend down a little bit. So here's the Federal Reserve recession. Price of oil continues to trend down a little bit because what's happening is OPEC is trying to collude on oil prices. But the problem with cartels is that individual cartel members have incentive to cheat, produce a little bit more than their share in order to inflate their profits. Well, when cartel members start doing that, that drives price down. By 1986, Saudi Arabia is like, well, if you can't beat them, join them. They start cheating too, and oil prices collapse back down to where they were before the first oil shock. These are nominal prices. If you adjust this price for inflation, it's about what it was in 1973. So again, you have this 13-year time period where the economy just gets hit by these two big supply shocks and a demand shock. And like I said, this means that there's a long time period of expensive oil, which means that there's this painful transition away from energy-intensive industries towards energy-efficient industries. So things like steel and autos just get hammered. This unleashes what's called a wave of rationalization. Rationalization means that these industries have to rationalize to reflect their permanently smaller size, which means that people get laid off by the tens of thousands. Cities that depend on these industries, cities like Gary, Indiana with steel, Flint, Michigan for autos, they never recover. This is consistent with MIT economist David Otter's work, who finds that cities with industries adversely affected by trade with China never recover from that Chinese trade shock. So this is a graph of U.S. iron and steel production. You can see it gets hammered by the first oil shock, never really recovers, gets hammered by the second one, gets hammered by the demand shock, and then emerges permanently smaller. Same story with autos. This is the graph of auto market share over time, particularly with General Motors. In their 1960s heyday, General Motors controlled about 50% of the U.S. auto market by themselves. They get hammered by the first oil shock, really get hammered by the second oil shock, and then their market share starts to trend downward. Because what happens is those two oil shocks and 13 years worth of expensive oil and gas just make gas guzzlers that General Motors produces a lot less appealing to consumers. And consumers switch away and start buying smaller, more fuel-efficient cars made by companies like Toyota and Honda. General Motors tried to make those types of cars, but they could just never get them quite right. So General Motors market share trends down, which culminates into their 2009 bankruptcy. So if you wonder why General Motors went bankrupt in 2009, the ball really gets rolling by that second oil shock in 1973. So let me conclude by run through historical business cycles by briefly discussing a largely forgotten oil shock, the 1990 oil shock. So as you can see from this slide, oil went from about $17 a barrel in June 1990 to about $36 a barrel in October 1990, which coincides with the recession, gray bar right here. However, unlike those two oil shocks I talked about earlier, this shock is very short-lived. Price of oil falls right back down by February 1991. So what caused this temporary oil shock? Turns out it was caused by the first Persian Gulf War and Saddam Hussein subsequently lighting his oil wells on fire during his retreat back to Iraq, which is what the picture in the background of the slide is. The reason why this oil shock was so short-lived was because the war was over quickly and world oil production as a result wasn't disrupted. There was an expectation at the time that the war would be long and maybe cost tens of thousands of lives, and the price of oil rose on that expectation. So when that expectation didn't materialize, the price of oil immediately fell. So as a result, there's a pretty mild recession. Gross domestic product only contracts by 0.01%, from 9.365 trillion in 1990 to 9.355 trillion in 1991. Unemployment hits less than 8% by June 1992. Because this was a mild recession, and because the price increase of oil wasn't permanent, or at least it wasn't long-lived, the economy didn't have to adapt to more expensive oil in the long run like it had to during the first two oil shocks. This is very fortunate because, as Paul Ingrassia in his 1994 book entitled Comeback discusses, General Motors nearly goes bankrupt during this recession, during this oil shock. They were saved by the fact that oil and gas go back to being really cheap. Then in the 1990s, General Motors is able to produce really profitable gas-guzzling trucks and SUVs. Then they get hammered by the rise in oil and gasoline prices in the 2000s. They go bankrupt in 2009. But if this oil shock was more permanent, that 2009 bankruptcy would have happened probably in 1991 or 1992. Paul Ingrassia, by the way, is the former bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal's Detroit bureau. You should read his book Comeback and his book Crash Course to understand the decline and the fall of the big three. But because this 1991 recession was so mild, because the oil shock was so short-lived, so temporary, this mild recession is mostly forgotten. Like I said, there's very little structural change in the economy. The economy didn't have to adapt to oil being more expensive in the long run. This recession is mostly remembered by political junkies because it's what propelled Bill Clinton's 1992 election victory on the slogan, quote, "It's the economy, stupid." So let me cycle this all the way back to COVID-19. The other trillion-dollar question is, well, is the COVID-19 supply shock analogous to the two supply shocks in the 1970s, or is it analogous to the supply shock in 1990, 1991? Because the lesson we learned from those supply shocks is that the longer the supply shock, the longer and more painful the recession, because the economy has to restructure and adapt to the new reality. On the flip side, if the supply shock is temporary and short-lived, you get a mild recession, and there's no long, painful transition because there's no new reality. The economy emerges after the supply shock looks a lot like the first. And that's what we saw in those three supply shocks that I talked about. So let's think about these two possibilities for COVID-19, and we don't really know what the possibility is going to be. We just kind of know one of two things is going to happen. The first thing that could happen is the good possibility that the COVID-19 supply shock looks a lot like the 1990-1991 supply shock. What that might mean is maybe the virus dies out over the summer, and everyone just gets back onto their lives. Bars and restaurants, retail establishments, office buildings, they all reopen. People begin traveling again. K-12 schools and colleges and universities open for the fall semester. Things like concerts and sporting events begin to be held again. People who lost their job get their old job back, because a short-lived supply shock means that most businesses aren't forced into permanent bankruptcy. Things like the unemployment insurance, $1,200 checks, grants and loans to small businesses are able to bridge the gap between when the shutdown began and when businesses can reopen. So if we get a 1990-1991 supply shock with COVID, we get a nice V-shaped recovery, quick contraction and quick expansion. There's little permanent change in the economy. There might be some, maybe the cruise ships don't come back. For instance, I just can't imagine ever wanting to take a cruise after this is all over. But to be fair, I never wanted to take one even before COVID hit. So that's the good situation with the COVID supply shock. Well, what's the bad scenario, bad situation? Well, the bad scenario with the COVID-19 supply shock is it looks a lot like the 1970s oil price shocks, which means that we're in for a long period of disruption. What that might mean is the virus is mitigated over the summer, or maybe there's multiple waves, we're not any better dealing with them as we were the first wave. And if that happens, the economy has to adjust to the new reality, just like it did for these two supply shocks, where the economy had to adjust to the new reality of oil being 10 times more expensive than what it was. It is troubling to think what this adjustment might look like if the COVID supply shock is long-lived as well. If the economy remains idled, $2 trillion stimuluses aren't possible anymore, because without goods and services being produced, repeatedly printing $2 trillion just results in hyperinflation. Bars and restaurants would have to permanently shut their doors, as would office buildings, as people work from home. Trendy cities that have banked on bars and restaurants driving people downtown would now see boarded up buildings as these things exit, just like Gary, Indiana, and Flint, Michigan did when steel and auto industries exited. The cruise ship industry would probably go bankrupt. Some airlines would probably go bankrupt. Some car companies would probably go bankrupt as the loss of income dries up the demand for new vehicles. Air travel, for instance, is 90% lower than it was same time last year. Probably almost every shopping mall in the U.S. would fail with a long-lived COVID supply shock, which would leave massive empty structures across the U.S. Maybe some sports leagues fail if games can't be played safely or can't be played with fans in attendance, because so many sports leagues are dependent on selling tickets to turn a profit. Movie theaters, theme parks, and resorts would all fail, as they can't be operated with the volume of people needed to ensure profitability. College and universities might fail with a long-lived COVID supply shock if closed campuses lead to less enrollment, as students find college less valuable without that on-campus experience. So those are all the industries that would shrink with a long-lived COVID supply shock, just like steel and auto shrank with those long-lived oil shocks. Well, what are the growth industries with a long-lived COVID shock? Well, the growth industries would be anything related to healthcare and technology. Things like telecommuting, online learning will all increase in profitability. Amazon.com would grow even larger as people shop online for almost everything. The economy would shift towards manufacturing things like personal protection equipment, face masks, and hand sanitizer, and less of everything else. The demand for doctors and nurses would get permanently larger, which would probably draw new graduates into those fields. So much like the long, painful restructuring after the 1970s oil shock, the restructuring during a long-term COVID supply shock would be painful. In short, the economy would shift towards healthcare and related goods and services, and towards things that people could do alone and away from everything else. The restructuring would be, to paraphrase Thomas Hobbes, solitary, poor, nastish, brutish, but it wouldn't be short. The 1973 to 83 time period gives us a glimpse of what that might look like. Where during that time period, the U.S. economy had two big supply shocks followed by a big demand shock. It was a period of inflation, economic instability, massive job losses, and a substantial restructuring of the economy. So, let's hope that doesn't happen. But my real fear is the longer that this shutdown persists, the more likely that scenario is. The longer the shutdown persists, the more likely it is we're moving away from the good 1990-1991 outcome towards the bad 1970s outcome. So that's all I've got today. They told me to finish at the top of the hour, and according to my watch, I'm right on time, so that's good because I like being on time. So I'm happy to take your questions. At the end of the slide, I just have some references to the books I referred to in my talk in case you want to read more about some of these issues. So thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed being here. So I will try to unshare my screen now.
listening to use the Q&A icon on the right, or perhaps it's at the bottom of your screen, to post your questions. And I think that was a pretty good historical perspective. What I took away from that is we've got a supply shock going on, primarily. Would that be a correct takeaway?
Can you say that again? I just didn't catch that.
From what I understand from your presentation, you're characterizing this as a supply shock more than a demand shock. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think the demand shock has been headed off with the actions taken by the federal government and the Federal Reserve, but eventually that will wear off. So right now,
so as we learn in Econ 101, supply shocks cause prices to go up and output to go down, but we don't see prices going up. Can you explain how this is different than the textbook supply shock?
So I do think that we are seeing some prices go up. So if you look at grocery prices, in April, grocery prices took the biggest jump on record, or one of the biggest jumps on record, where they increased at something like a 14% annualized rate. I think why you're not seeing prices across the board rise is because the rest of the economy is just shut down, which is suppressing inflation in those sectors. So as a result, the grocery price increase is kind of getting washed out of the broader consumer price index. So that's where it's a little bit different than the textbook supply shock, because we're kind of forcing prices to remain stable by shutting down those industries.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to go to the Q&A. People are posting questions now. Sarah asks, what are your predictions to which outcome it will be? You gave us a couple of options there. So,
I'll tell you what I think should happen, and I'll tell you what I'm afraid is going to happen. So I think we should get the 1990-1991 outcome, where if you go back to March, people are making some pretty dire predictions about hospitals being overrun, ICU beds being in short supply, there being a shortage of ventilators. The governor of California predicted 70 to 80% of Californians would be infected by May. And none of those things materialized. So my thought is, well, we should start lifting the lockdowns. And Georgia lifted their lockdown 3 weeks ago. They haven't seen an uptick in cases. Maybe we should go back to packing 100,000 people in the big house. But to continue having businesses and restaurants shut down, I think that's a bit hard to justify. So we should get the 1990 to 1991 outcome. Will I predict we're going to get that? I can't go that far because I'm not seeing a lot of push by policymakers to start lifting the lockdown. Like I mentioned, I think the goalposts are being shifted, that we bent the curve. Well, now we can't end the lockdown until we either mitigate the virus or get a vaccine. Well, if that's what happens, then we're going to get that 1970s outcome where things get really messy. We're not going to be able to paper over the gap between the shutdown beginning and ending with monetary and fiscal policy, because you just can't print money and buy the same amount of goods and services when 40% of the economy is just not online. I think policymakers might not appreciate that enough. And I think a real big problem with the shutdown is that you really do have two Americas. America number one's doing okay. Their checks are still rolling in. They can still buy groceries. They're working at home. You can't go on vacation, which is a bit annoying, but overall life goes on. And America number two is, they're in tough shape. They're not homeless yet. They're not the Hooverville yet, but there are, modern day breadlines of that. There are food banks, 4, 5, 6 hour waits. Those are people who are worried that their temporary layoff might turn permanent if their business eventually runs out of cash and all of a sudden can't pay the mortgage or the rent. And I think the problem is America number one is calling the shots and America number two is kind of off on the sideline. So that's a kind of long answer to say, as time goes on, I'm starting to think that the 1970s outcome is becoming more likely.
Well, that's upsetting, but
maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
I hope so. Bob asks the question, how do economic recessions affect public health? Do we see more deaths, less deaths, or no noticeable changes?
I think it's hard for recessions because most recessions aren't that long-lived. So it's hard to say what trends emerge after a recession. When a recession typically is over like a year, even Great Recession was a year and a half. Um, there's some evidence that suicides go down during a recession, but either I've never seen the explanation for it or I can't remember why that's the case, although I'm fairly skeptical, like I said, to draw a trend from a pretty short-lived event. What I think is more troubling are the studies that show what happens to workers who face unemployment. Where, the textbook model says, unemployment's pretty short-lived, you get a downturn, people are laid off, the economy recovers, they get their jobs back. But when you study unemployment due to recessions, what you find is people who are unemployed, they take a permanent lifetime hit in income. Their income never really recovers from that spell of unemployment. And that does lead to shortened lifespans. So I think there's an underappreciation by policymakers in terms of how devastating unemployment is to someone facing it. And I think cynically, but probably correctly, is that most policymakers have never been unemployed. They don't really know how bad it is.
Logan asks, do you think the theory that there's a lot of pent-up demand is correct? If we reopened the economy today, how do you think that would affect the supply shock? How would this look like when people 20 years from now are looking back?
Yeah, people talk about pent-up demand. And as far as I can tell, there's not a great theory behind pent-up demand. At least I've never seen it in the textbooks, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it just makes it hard to answer the question. But what I think pent-up demand means is that when you think back to the Great Depression, you have like a 15 or 16-year time period where people can't buy a new car, they can't buy a washing machine, things like that. So when times get good, there's a big rush to buy those things, which causes industrial production to go shooting way up. And maybe there's something to be said about that. I hope so, because that means the auto industry will eventually recover. But I don't know how much pent-up demand you could have for something like services. If you go a month without eating at a restaurant, it's not like you could eat 2 dinners once the restaurants reopen to make up for all the dinners you didn't eat while they were closed. So it's not like the restaurant could get like a big wave of sales after things reopen to make up for what was lost when they were shut down. Maybe the best we could hope for is that people who otherwise wouldn't eat out just have this big desire to do so because they're like freed from their house. But I think since this is a service-driven recession, which is kind of the first recession that's being service-driven we've seen, it's hard to say how things like pent-up demand transition from goods towards services.
Now, you mentioned that bankruptcies could be the difference between a short and a long-lived recession. But you used as your example, General Motors. But what about bankruptcies at small businesses? Do you see them coming back, reopening, and could that put us into that longer category?
Yeah, I think if we see, I've seen predictions about a biblical wave of bankruptcies coming, which has been held off so far by the Federal Reserve just injecting unlimited liquidity to the financial markets. But like I said, there's only so long the Federal Reserve could do that before bad things happen. So if we do see bankruptcies, I use General Motors as an example, but if we see a massive wave of small business bankruptcies and also a massive wave of personal bankruptcies, then the recovery, I think, is really, really slow. Just because it clogs up the bankruptcy courts. It seizes up the credit markets as creditors don't get repaid and they have to wait for the bankruptcy courts to sort things out. And then the economy that emerges is just smaller than what it was going into this because all of a sudden you have fewer small businesses out there. Eventually, small businesses are going to just run out of cash because if a small business shuts, yeah, it does save on the variable costs, things like wages, things like food. If it's a restaurant, maybe it saves on some utilities, but there are still some fixed costs, mortgage payments, rent payments. There's still some utilities you have to pay, and the longer that drags on, the more and more businesses won't be able to cover those fixed costs, and they'll fail. So the longer this drags on, I think the more likely you get to having this big wave of bankruptcies and then causing the economy to really enter into a severe recession and making the recovery much more slow. And the question is how much longer before we see those wave of bankruptcies? Is it a month? Is it 2 months? It's hard to know. Surveys out there for small businesses aren't very encouraging, where you see, a majority of small businesses saying, well, if this lasts a month longer, we're out of money. So all I can just do is give a probabilistic answer and say the longer this drags on, the more probable it is that you see an uptick in bankruptcies and see a financial crisis and a slow recovery.
Well, I am struck by what you said about unemployment affecting a person's lifetime income. And that means being separated from your current job is potentially, even though it's temporary, does have these permanent effects. Would you comment on the policies that we have used to keep people on the job or to expand unemployment benefits? It seems like we've got a lot of policies. Are they good or bad at keeping people on the job? What could we be doing better, perhaps learning from other countries and the way they've handled this?
So ordinarily, I'm not a huge fan of paying people to stay on the job during a downturn, just because a lot of recessions mean economic restructuring. So the more we postpone that restructuring, the more painful and slow the recovery is. So for instance, like in 08, 09, you probably don't want to pay a bunch of home builders to stay on the job when the home building industry has to permanently shrink. It's a tough thing to say, but when restructuring happens, it's really painful, but it still has to happen. But I think this time is different in that there are really no fundamental flaws before COVID-19. That back in January, February, the economy was pretty strong. There are some problems, of course, but no one was really flashing warning signs saying, well, this particular sector is going to cause us problems, like what happened in 08, 09. Without COVID, we probably get an economy that looks a lot like 2020 or looks a lot like 2019, which was a pretty good year for the economy. So with that said, I think the policies to pay people to stay on the job aren't the worst policies in the world, because what you want to have happen is for things to rapidly pick back up once the lockdown lifts. And if a business could keep everyone on payroll, well, it's really easy to call everyone back to work rather than having to go through the hiring process all over again. And by paying people to stay on the job, you do prevent people from having that spell of unemployment, because even though you're not working, you're still getting paid from your employer, and it's less likely that your lifetime income is going to take that hit. I think the policies have been implemented, somewhat poorly. Like the Paycheck Protection Program seems to be implemented, fairly poorly, in that the money's not going to the small businesses who were the intended recipients. The unemployment insurance system seems to be overwhelmed, running archaic 1960s COBOL computer code, which is leading to backlogs and collecting unemployment. So some sort of wage subsidy during this time to kind of tide people over until the lockdown is lifted, I think is the right call, just so that the recovery could be that much more rapid and people could get called back up to go back to work very quickly.
So I've heard some small businesses who actually have the opportunity to hire more are having difficulty because some people are making more through their unemployment benefits than they are. And of course, there's always the risk associated with interacting with the public, so maybe that's part of it. But there are some staffing problems that people are experiencing right now.
Yeah, I think the problem is that $600, for lack of a better word, bonus to unemployment as part of the CARES Act. That was just a blanket $600 to everyone, which means that for some people, you could collect more on unemployment than what you were making when you were working. So if a job opportunity arises, you lose too much in unemployment to go back to work. And the reason why it was that $600 bonus apparently was because the computer code is so old that the unemployment insurance runs on that it would have just taken way too long in order to tailor the bonus towards different wage levels. So Congress says in the interest of expediency, we'll just pay everyone $600. Now it has this unintended consequence of if opportunities arise, it might be a tough call to go back to work.
That reminds me of something. I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, that reminds me of something your colleague Mark Perry said about the origins of our current healthcare system. When we, for the sake of expediency, decided not to tax benefits while we were under wage and price controls, and as a result, employers started offering free health insurance, and that had a permanent effect and distorting the healthcare market and our economy. It sounds like something like this is happening with this. We did this for the sake of expediency, and now it may be having some real effects on our labor market.
Yeah, at least this is intended to be temporary. I think it runs out of July. But the issue will be that when July hits, there's going to be a huge amount of political pressure to extend it, maybe towards the end of the year. November 2020 is an election, so will elected officials be really willing to cut this off in July 2020 when they're facing maybe a contested primary in a month, or at least re-election in a few months? So there's going to be a lot of political pressure to kind of make this permanent, just like the tax exemption for healthcare was made permanent.
So, Brandon, thank you for your patience. He has a question for you about getting further into the topic. Do you have a book you can recommend which would talk about why perhaps the Federal Reserve did not act more aggressively to expand the money supply during the Depression?
That's one of those unsolved mysteries in economics. I've never heard a convincing argument made for why the Federal Reserve didn't do that, other than Milton Friedman speculated that there was like an absence of leadership at the Federal Reserve at the time, where the longtime chairman had resigned and there was like a power struggle at the Board of Governors. I heard a Planet Money podcast where someone speculated that the Federal Reserve had loaned money to banks and they just wanted to kind of pull back and wait and see what happened, but that doesn't explain why they just pulled back and let a third of them go down before intervening again. I don't have a lot of great books to recommend because it's one of those mysteries. I would recommend A Monetary History of the United States by Milton Friedman. He also has a book called Monetary Mischief, where he talks about episodes in monetary history like that. So maybe check out those two books. At least it gives you some background about what happened, even if no one really knows why it happened. Although there's always the explanation, which is more correct than we'd like to admit, that it's just blatant incompetence, that there's like no rhyme or reason to it. But it's like, why did the CDC send out those test kits in February that were contaminated with COVID-19?
Well, unfortunately, we have to end on that note. We've come to the end of this particular session. I would like to thank you once again, Dr. Douglas, for your appearance. It's been a pleasure, as always, to have you back again at the Freedom Seminar. And thank you all for participating. Remember to check out our website to see all the sessions that we're offering here. And that's available at www.northwood.edu/freedom-seminar. So northwood.edu freedom seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. It's great to be here, and hopefully next year I'll see you in person.
Yes, I hope so.